our webinar, Effective Cyber Risk Posture, the Value Proposition of Cybersecurity. A quick look at the agenda for today. First up, we'll go through a brief introduction and a little bit of housekeeping. Then Jane will take over and she'll look at the objectives of the webinar, then go into criticality of cyber risk posture when making risk-based decisions, how to develop effective cyber risk posture, ROI, value of cybersecurity controls, and then we'll have some question and answers. In terms of introductions, my name is Clayton Scott. I am the Account Director for Asia at Sword GRC. For those of you who have attended our webinars before, I'd like to welcome you back. And if it's your first time, we warmly welcome you and hope you can take something of value away with you today. Our speaker today, Jane Tay, is a forthcoming and forward-thinking risk management and cybersecurity consultant. 16 years of experience in Europe and the APAC region. Jane advises and guides the implementation of practical security, crisis and risk management strategies for local and multinationals in industries such as banking, insurance, energy, and consultancy. Jane writes and publishes computer forensic science journals for UK universities and Chamber of Commerce, and has given talks to academic institutions and businesses across a wide range of industries. So we're in for a real treat today. This webinar will go for approximately 35 minutes with plenty of time for questions at the end. If you'd like to ask a question, simply write your question using the Q&A button and we'll collate those throughout and answer them at the end. If we don't get to answering those questions along the way or throughout the webinar, we'll respond via email after the webinar, and a recording of this webinar will also be made available to all those that have registered after the webinar as well. So there's plenty of time to absorb the information and plenty of avenues to keep in touch with us. So thank you, Jane. We really do look forward to your presentation today.
Thanks, Clayton. Welcome, everyone. Just before I start, just for your information, there will be more text on the screen for quick referencing purposes, because some find it a bit hard to retrieve auditory information. So, right, let's jump right in. Now, this webinar would like to address cybersecurity risk challenges commonly faced in risk and management arena. We would like to delve into the approaches and perspectives gathered throughout my 16 years working with the working levels and the executive management of major industries. Let's get the fundamentals right. Before the webinar starts, I'm already losing my voice. Sorry. Right, the terminology, cybersecurity postures and the cyber risk assessment. I'm sure you know what cyber risk assessment, but we would like to delve more into cybersecurity posture. So cybersecurity posture looks at the existing and lack of operational and governance controls surrounding the protection of assets, identify current threat landscapes that might expose our crown jewels or our assets. Now, as you may all know, cybersecurity risk assessment looks at the risk that an asset class is now being exposed to, drawing from the cybersecurity posture study and what remediation measures are put in place to plug the security hole or reduce the level of risk. Now, from personal experience, I would recommend before you start doing the cybersecurity postures, always consult, if permits, within your internal cybersecurity team or your security team, or outsource consultants or anyone, that to understand the vulnerabilities leveraged by hackers and how they could exploit it based on your asset classifications, which we'll go into deeper later on. So As for cyber risk assessment, I'm sure you already done this a million times. So what are the risks? And how do we put measures in to defend or protect the organizations for example, passing, residue risk to cyber insurance by adopting cyber insurance policies that covers risk area that can't, be significantly reduced or imminent risk, or to improve the high risk scenario cyber breach playbook, or to enhance the counter attack capabilities in-house. So those are the measures that we can look at in cyber risk assessment. But today we're going to focus on cybersecurity posture. Now, let's look at the criticality of cyber risk posture when making risk-based decisions. Now, in the World Bank Group and Bank Negara, which is the central bank of Malaysia, last December, they have identified a common agreement between both of them from their surveys that cyber incidents have become a top concern on bank CROs and most of the board members. And the senior managers just focusing on the technological problem of cybersecurity and pushing, not understanding what their role as senior managers or decision makers plays in the incident response process. So the most common misconception is they think cybersecurity belongs to the IT department and they are the department that should handle it. Now, on the contrary, because defending a business is not just IT department's role, it's the whole collective organization. So I do agree that cyber risk is at the core technical issues that the IT needs to address. But however, defending a company or a business profitability or bottom line is a whole organization's responsibility. So pick, for example, if you just rely on the IT department to handle cybersecurity or to protect the organization, what I always see is that the security team and the technical team always go into the technical tools like CVSS, which is what we call the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It's a traditional tools that we scan for vulnerabilities and prioritize the remediation efforts based on the CVSS score, Common Vulnerability Scoring System. Now that is so highly, technical, but they don't take into account the business perspective of whether that risk or that vulnerability actually pose a significant impact onto the business. So that's the first misconception. And moving on to the second misconception is treating cybersecurity as a compliance issue. So we have endless checklists, one after another, whether it be COVID, Sarbanes-Oxley, ISO 27001. It's just meeting the regulatory requirement, which we have to, I understand that, and there's a lot of resources devoted to just meeting regulatory or standards requirements. However, as you can see on today's market, every big companies, big and small, are being hacked left and right. And they just don't know why. They've done all this checklist after checklist, but they do not develop a real resilience because they're just following a checklist and completely omit what is the real threat. Sorry. So it is important for the top level to understand the importance of an accurate cyber risk posture. Why do we need cyber risk posture? It's so that we know where we stand when it comes to making a risk-based decision around our asset exposure. Now, from experience, the top and bottom level expectation of what is significant in terms of cybersecurity exposure are not clearly communicated, which creates more confusion and frustration for both sides. Now, I would recommend or suggest, based on experience, to develop a what-if risk model for identified assets, where a quantitative compound score applied to each asset based on the expected liability it yields and the probability or frequency it will happen. For example, What if scenario could be applied to assessing an asset? So in this case, we use a pound generator, for example, where possible scenarios of cyber hacking is very likely due to legacy infrastructure that was designed without security in mind. Now we know that it's too expensive to replace the whole infrastructure of the power grid compared to putting alternative security controls by segregating the network layers, creating a DMZ, which is what we call a demilitarized zone in networking and security, to host critical servers or monitoring applications of the power grid from directly exposed to the internet. Another example of putting critical internet-facing payment application behind a web application firewall to constantly patching the software is what we're looking at. So what if scenario or the risk model with a weighted risk scoring based on criterion of your choice, whichever you see is appropriate for the risk scoring or to set the criteria, is used to score each asset, expected liability and probability. So if we do this correctly, the board or the decision makers will have an accurate cyber risk posture of the organization assets, its associated liabilities, and where resources should be allocated to mitigate such risks. I hope I'm not going too fast. Now moving on to communications. Another challenge I witness is the ability to communicate or paint the right picture with the right message from working level to the top level and vice versa. If the essence of the message is not understood, no action will be taken by any parties. And if it is an imminent threat that's going to hit the organization assets will be fully exposed at the failure of communication. Now, there are 5 points that I've drawn out. I'll give specific examples later on in later slides. So I'm just going to briefly go through this. So in order to breach the communication gap between the business level and the working group level or technical level, regardless of your positions, you need to have the buy-in support from the colleagues and peers at any level. So this is common sense. But I would say have a universal security business vocabulary. So for example, if you're using a technical jargon term or whatever, have a glossary sheet prepared and provide to the opposite parties or whichever stakeholders that you're holding a meeting with so that we are on the same page and so that they know what we're expecting and what we're talking about, to make them, to educate them basically, and have a more open discussions on the issue at hand and iron things out, which is something I don't see. And as a whole conflict of, which department is doing what and so on. So I would say extend the olive branch by being the first one to open up what issues you have and ask for your peers for help from another department and so on. And people tend to be more helpful if we actually allow them to. So that's what I've experienced. And second point is to build stronger vendors and more resilient security ecosystem. Now, as you can see, for example, DXC recently has been compromised, and they're one of the vendor for big, large insurance companies. So I would say establish a good working relationship with the stakeholders and your vendors, your third parties, or your service provider, to have that relationship. So if anything happens, or to build a stronger security ecosystem by involving them as a chain of supply security, as we can see during this pandemic. One shuts off and it trickles down and snowballed. So, and educating the board of directors and the senior managers on what is essential, what is security, because not everyone on the board has any security or into technical, have the technical, knowledge and so on. So moving on to the third point, not reporting meaningless numbers to business. So this one, we're going to have a specific example at a later slides. So what's important isn't just about the numbers that we presented upwards, but how those measurements or how those numbers highlight that business story and illustrate what CISO, CTO, or CIO are doing on a daily basis to solve problems and further business or organization goals. Point 4. Now, by assigning easy to understand metric to a risk type, security ratings translate technology to business. You're aligning the metrics to key business functions within an organization is what's really important to the board. The whole idea is for the CRO, CISO, CSO, CIO to work with the business units to understand what critical processes need to be maintained in order for the business to succeed. Now, by measuring things that can impact the bottom line, the security and risk functions are then aligning to what keeps the business afloat, which is where the business decision makers are most concerned. Now, for example, if a third-party risk assessment study has found out on a vendor who scores below average for updating their application software, so for example, for patching or not patching their software as often as they should, they should score an above average of risk for a data breach. So the likelihood of to have a data breach or pilfering of data is higher than average. So as more CISO or CRO, CSO use security ratings that are easy to understand and metrics that are easy to understand, it bridges the communication gaps between vendors, the boards, and the relevant business departments to recognize the value of security ratings in easing the conversation. Last but not least, between the C-suite and mid-management, what constitutes a significance for those level of management? What content should be reported out? So a lot of times that working group level see that they need to present, numbers on how many end devices or viruses that we have stopped and so on. So that is not significant in terms of the C-suite or mid-management because it's a prerequisite. They see it as a fundamentals of security. You should have done that as a compulsory mandatory. Now, what is the bonuses? What I need to know at C-suite or mid-management is what impacts business. Do we suffer from profitability loss or reputational damage? So one of the barriers I see is not communicating from the top to the working level and vice versa. So we can always establish a good metric that measures the performance of individual objectives or KPIs by having a clear reporting objective set from the top of what is significant to them, what do they feel it should be presented on the round table at the C-suite that is aligned to the business goals and objectives. And that way, by having an organizational strategies at the top, pushing it to the working levels, they can properly align and provide the expected level of success for the business. And the last point, what I've also observed is if at the board level, there's just one person that knows about cybersecurity or IT risk, they can lend a huge amount of help to those people working levels, especially when they do not have a large security team or the large security budgets, because the board person can actually share the significance of what is important at the board level and convince the other board of directors that we need to look into this seriously or we can brush this up because this is not important and so on. Now, moving into how do we actually create or develop an effective cyber risk posture? Now, as you can see on the screen, I've drawn out 4 stages. So the first stage is your assets inventory. First, you need to know every single assets that you have in the organization and the subsidiaries companies. What they are, categorizing, are they intellectual properties, what are they sensitive data, customer transaction data, or physical assets. Now, upon doing that, you know what are the devices you have, the applications, the user, and their interdependency and relationship they have with each other, so that you know if something is hit, for example, you've got ransomware, or you've been compromised, you know what are the interrelationship between what is affected, what data has been pilfered throughout that compromisation. Now, moving on to the next stage, which is to assess. Once you've done all your asset classification and your identification, you need to look at what are the attack vectors that will most likely could happen to those, for example, sensitive data. Now, is it credentials attacks, or denial of service, taking down a website, payment website, identity access control? So what are the likelihood at the moment in the open that affect sensitive data? So for now, it's ransomware, because everyone is remote working, this pandemic and so on. So that is the highly, vulnerable area that the hackers or the ill-intended individuals would like to take advantage of, because the payment, it looks like most of global companies are paying up the ransomware, and they're going a bit more savvy by assessing the company's ability to pay, what kind of volumes of, based on their transactions, they will estimate what kind of profitability the company has been making and what kind of paid up ransomware they could afford. And they will want to make it cost effective so that you pay up instead of, engaging your backups and so on and so forth. And moving on to the next phase, which is to analyze. So once you've done the identification of assets, you know what attack vectors are most likely to hit which area or which category of assets. You need to look at what are the vulnerabilities, and will those vulnerabilities then turn into a real imminent threat, which is, waiting to be hacked, or you can say, okay, this is not so important, we can leave that aside and focus on security measures or controls that will mitigate sensitive data areas or highly exposed assets, basing it on the business criticality. And moving on to the last phase, which is once you've identified those 3, what are the assets exposure and which are the highly probability of being exposed, then you can assign the owners, budgets, and so on, and set the goals and review the outcomes of the controls and testing the actual controls itself. Now, in terms of testing the actual controls, you might want to, if budget permitted and time permits, do a simulation test on the actual solution that's been applied on that security control. And another further points, with the changing risk posture or the environment of threat, attack vectors and attack surface across the evolving cyber landscape, I would normally recommend every month, at least at a monthly basis, to look and review your risk posture and your assets inventory. So whatever assets been added or removed, it should be updated as and when you retrieve the data. And another point is making sure that your security policies and procedures throughout the organization is clear, easy to understand, easy to follow, and everyone should be made aware their responsibility as the first line of defense for the company. And to foster internal champions, if possible, if you have the budget, to drive security efforts forward. because tens and thousands of IT assets are, and hundreds or even thousands of ways of organization can be breached nowadays. So finding the weak point, using comprehensive and continuous risk posture assessment will help you protect your business from costly intrusion later on. Therefore, do not forget to update asset inventory and attack vectors as and when assets are added or removed, or the changing of attack landscape that is currently targeting your industry or other industry that might affect yours. So moving on to the hot topic of ROI. It's on everyone's roundtables discussion and agenda. How much do we spend on security, and what is the return of investment from it? Now, sadly, I have to disagree with the word used, which is ROI. Reason being, security itself is a cost-saving exercise and expense. Why do I say that? Because it's to prevent loss prevention, your profitability, your damage of reputations. So for example, as we human takes medical or health insurance with the aim of, should we one day needed medical attention or assistance, we do not need to fear that we do not have the funds or the capabilities to actually treat the medical or health issues. Same goes to cybersecurity. You spend on cybersecurity to protect or to safeguard, just in case that you're being hacked or you're being breached. And that breach is going to cost more than what you spend on the security expenses or the security controls. So I do not agree with using ROI to measure cybersecurity expenses. On the exception, with one exception, should you build your own infrastructure, IT infrastructure, security infrastructure, whatever, and outsource it as a service, business service to other companies, then I do agree with, ROI calculation in that aspect. So anyone who has sat on the board or decision-making table with a constant barrage of cyber attacks, technical jargon are being presented, but the roundtable could not make sense of the significance of achieving the business objectives. So you can keep telling them, okay, we spend this much on security, this is what we've done, we put a firewall, firewall does this and that. Now they keep presenting the number of attack or attempted attacks hitting their firewall, for example. And this sense of panic in the boardroom, I've seen it in real life, and they were all scratching their head and wondering, what is this? And I don't understand it. So to breach that communication gap is the main concern from the board or the C-suite is, what asset is being exposed? How likely will it happen? And its impact on the bottom line. So again, as anyone who have lived through a company vicious end-of-year budget slashing exercise knows, when you're trying to make your numbers, cutting costs is the same as increasing revenues. So security is not a profitability expense, but it's a cost-saving exercise. So moving on to the technical side of it, which I mentioned earlier on, the few points in terms of bridging the barriers. Number one, please stop presenting the number of attacks to senior management on board, because first, and it's not significant content, or it's not a value added metrics for them, because they don't know how does it affect my business objective, reaching my business objective. Secondly, how does those metrics tell me whether are we safer or are we weaker in terms of security? Are we likely to get hacked? That's their main concern. So I would say focus on the high risk probability and impact metrics that could actually inflate the organization bottom line. So a few examples I came up with is, and I've used with other companies, use mean time to detect, which is what we call the MTTD. So MTTD measures how long it takes from the time of successful attack to the time of detection. So from the time of successful attack to the time of detection, that's when you can actually measure your security solution or security expenses that you have spent is actually worthwhile. Next point is MTTR, which is what we call the mean time to recover. It measures the percentage of users impacted by an incident, how quickly the security team resolved the issue, and whether that time meets, exceeds, or falls short of targeted times based on the organization's established appetite for risk. And VAPT is vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. So that's an exercise where your internal team, or you can outsource this to another third party to conduct this exercise by behaving like an external hacker, going by black box and going in blind and try to find out vulnerabilities within your organization's network, whether it be printers, going through your air conditioning server or network. That way you can see whether your security controls are actually, doing its job. And the next point, whether the security department's ability to manage vulnerabilities to the greatest effect based on the organization's security posture. So based on, once you've done the organization security posture, you know where your assets are likely to be hacked. Those emphasis, you can then tie it to your vulnerability management metrics by measuring whether your security departments are actually tackling the identified vulnerabilities that is most highly probable or frequent, the frequency of materializing that is high. Now, moving on to the next metric, which is the annual loss expectancy. So we're not going to go into the calculation itself, but the gist of obtaining good, accurate, high-quality data is crucial when we do ALE calculation. Now, for an insurance company or banks, they normally have actual expertise that can do the calculations for them and formulating prices, their cost of damages. Now, if your company do not have the luxury of tapping into those expertise, I would recommend to use the data of similar threat occurrences that has been happening in other industry or other countries and try to formulate and estimate it with your own current data of your turnover transactions, your revenues per day, and so on. Now, in the past, we measure performance metrics using input metrics. So resources committed to a program, for example, the money, time, staff, expertise, the methods, and the facilities the organization commits to bring about the intended outcomes, output, or impact from a project. That's measured by using input metrics. Now, at the moment, we're going at output metrics. So the numerical counts of programs, action, or products that were created or delivered. For example, number of people you have served, activities or services provided to you. So for example, the cybersecurity training program provides 50 certified professionals. However, the performance metric is moving now to organizations to get the next level of measuring outcomes and impact, because you want to know where your money is spent and is it worthwhile, is it working or is it not working, and how do we strategize. So the outcomes measurement metrics is preferred at the moment. We're moving into that area now. What the program wishes to achieve. For example, you conduct a phishing test before and after the cybersecurity awareness training. Was there visible short, mid, or long-term or indirect effects of the cybersecurity training program? Did more employee pass the phishing mock test after the training compared to pre-training? Is the outcome number going in the positive direction? If it's not, we need to revise the strategies and so on. So that's, measuring it on the outcome metrics. Last but not least, key risk indicator. As we all know, KRI are metrics used by organizations to provide an early signal of increasing risk exposure in various areas of the enterprise or how risky an activity is. So for example, if an organization's security goal is to minimize business disruption, there is an objective that can be measured and tracked. Or if an organization wants to see and improve security alignment to technology deployment, the CISO, CIO, CRO could create and track measurements that show how, when, and where the security team engages with tech-related procurements, architecture designs, and how security team weigh in or vet the security or vet the vendor's security controls and how those improve over time. So those can be metrics or measurements. So by combining all these three metrics or value-added metrics measurements, you should have yourself a board visible loss prevention and solid cost saving numbers on the bottom line. And that's it from me. I know it's a lot to pack in, but I would welcome any questions you may have. Clayton, I'll sit on to you.
Thank you, Jane. Really appreciate that. And you're right, there is a lot of information there for us to take in. Just checking to see if there's any questions from the floor before we proceed. If you feel like it, you can reach out to Jane directly with her email address listed there, or you can contact us. We will be sending you a message at the end of this webinar with our contact details, and actually continuing our series of events and webinars into the future. You can check out our website for future webinars as well. Jane, we really do appreciate the time and effort that you took to put that information together and to deliver it. It's a tricky conversation in such an easy to digest way. So we thank you very much for that and appreciate it. And I'll just give a couple of seconds to see if any questions come through.
Thank you, Clayton. That's very kind of you.
No problem, Jane. Very much appreciated again. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And we look forward to welcoming you all back soon.
Thank you, everyone.